The Solicitor General must stand down. She has no right. She has no right to be in this position that is so influential, so powerful in New Zealand, the example of law as it should be. She has failed repeatedly, continuously.
This is Lake Alice abuse survivor Leonie McEnroe. She wants the Attorney-General, Judith Collins, to remove Solicitor-General Una Jagose from her position. She and other survivors say they've been re-traumatised by the state's decades-long effort to cover up the abuse and torture they suffered, a cover-up spelt out clearly in one paragraph in the massive report by the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in Care. As the government's chief legal advisor, Jagose has been responsible for heading the Crown's response to survivors' legal claims. Trying to stop those claims going ahead has cost millions.
The government has spent more than $3.5 million defending itself against historic claims in the last decade. The figure, obtained under the Official Information Act, is likely to be a conservative estimate of the true amount the Crown has spent.
That defence included withholding documents that would have helped their claims, delaying claims for so long that the statute of limitations swung in, and using tactics of intimidation, all to protect the Crown from being liable for potentially billions in compensation payments, for saving the government from international embarrassment.
It's an adversarial model which re-traumatises all those that have to go through the process. And it's often done by the Crown with the full knowledge that these are meritorious claims.
When you think about what could have been done for survivors and should have been done with that money, that's probably another, $20,000, $30,000 per survivor that could have been paid out, if not more. It shows a lack of morality.
When you look at this in its entirety, going back many, many decades, for which we've had resistance, denial and minimisation, the cost of this will be astronomical.
I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, why Una Jagose is the focus of anger for survivors of abuse.
It's not one mistake. She just continues to fail.
And why they won't believe an apology that she has anything to do with.
The words are scripted. The words are manufactured. The words of apology, you know, they have wordsmiths working on it on behalf of this national shame, this national disgrace. The Solicitor General is our national shame and our national disgrace. The way the Crown has behaved is our national shame and national disgrace.
Newsroom investigative journalist Aaron Smale has written a 5-part series from his 8 years of investigations on the political and legal strategy the Crown used for decades to marginalise and defeat claims from victims of state abuse and torture. Newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy says the Royal Commission report into that abuse fills 16 volumes, produced after years of hearings and decades of complaints.
It's almost too big for the public to take in unless someone, somewhere, spends the time to analyse it down. It was an obligation, I think, on someone in the media, on behalf of the public, to highlight and bring it into focus very clearly that this went on. This paragraph, as I say, that the Royal Commission's talked about a political and the public service, a cover-up, which is pretty powerful, that we, I think, had an obligation to say, well, let's look in detail to what they said explicitly about elements of that cover-up and to show that and to put it out there clearly, not to let it be smothered. So that's why, and it's certainly no focus on her in particular as a person or anything else. It's just the role and the agency and its obligation and our obligation.
Newsroom's political editor Laura Walters also joins me. I asked her first about the Solicitor General's role and Una Jagose's background.
The Solicitor General is often described as the junior law officer. So she is the second highest officer of the law for the Crown in New Zealand, only sitting below the Attorney General, who is Judith Collins at the moment. And it's her job to uphold the law, to prosecute and defend on behalf of the Crown. And she has been in the role since 2016. So she is obviously a lawyer by training, and she came up through the public service ranks. She started at Consumer Affairs and worked as a lawyer there for quite a while, but then decided that she wanted something more, and then she moved over to Crown Law. She did this quite, I think, revealing or really insightful lecture a while ago to some university law students where she was talking about, the path in her career, and she said that she never planned to become the Solicitor General.
I think if I had wanted to be the Solicitor General, I don't think I would have made it. So I feel like I've had a funny old career path to the job, which I think surely is one of the most interesting jobs a lawyer can have in this country, and it's certainly turning out to be that.
But because she was good at debating and she was good at English at school, and her brother is also a lawyer who I think is now a High Court Justice, that law seemed like a natural path for her. She went into the public service, Consumer Affairs, then moved over to Crown Law, and she was there for a while, working on a number of cases, and it could be things right across the public service. It might be working for, say, MPI, or, doing, say, a fisheries prosecution or something like that. But she also, we know, during that time working as a lawyer for Crown Law, started to work on quite a few of these abuse and care cases. So you'll remember that they started back in the 90s, including with some Lake Alice survivors who we now know were tortured during their time at Lake Alice Hospital in the Children's Psychiatric Unit.
It was torture hidden behind closed doors. In the 1970s, vulnerable children in the adolescent unit at Lake Alice Psychiatric Hospital faced unimaginable abuse. They were drugged, punished with electric shocks, and subjected to physical and sexual assaults.
So she was working on a lot of these cases, as she came up through Crown Law. And then she did a secondment to the GCSB, where she was head there, and then she came back across to Crown Law. And then in 2016, I think by Chris Finlayson, who was the Attorney General at the time, she was appointed to that top role of Solicitor General. And she's been there ever since. And her last reappointment was for a 2-year term earlier this year in May by Judith Collins. So she's been there for quite a while now in that top job.
So this isn't a political thing where every time there's a change in government, they turf out the old, get in the new?
No, generally not. I mean, you will see, like all heads in the public service, that sometimes new governments come in if there's an opportunity to change people and get someone who's more closely aligned with their government's vision and priorities, they will do that. But generally, the idea is that the Solicitor General is a neutral, independent public servant, and that people essentially look to them to, uphold the rule of law in the country, and should really make sure that the Crown is being, what they call a model litigant, that, they're looking to the long-term vision for New Zealand, not just serving, the government of the day.
So Collins must have a level of faith in her to not be looking around for another candidate.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of the best information we have at the moment. And I think that there's still a bit to play out in this saga. So, things could change, but we do know that, earlier this year in May, Collins reappointed the Solicitor General for another 2-year term. Now, I think it's unlikely, considering how long she's been in that role, that it will be renewed beyond that. She has been there for a really long time now, and regardless of what her history is, what she's done, what the political feelings are to have someone in that role for that long, you'd start to question it. You might think that, there needs to be a change there. But so far, publicly, Judith Collins has backed her Solicitor General. I have been told by people who are, well-placed sources, that there have been conversations behind closed doors. Obviously, there's been some questions recently around the Solicitor General's prosecution guidelines, which sits quite separately to this. But it's another thing where Judith Collins has come out and publicly said she's given her a bit of a talking to, I guess, a go back and have another look at this. We're not so happy about that.
The Solicitor General has admitted she missed the mark when releasing new prosecution guidelines this week, asking judges and lawyers to think carefully about how Māori are impacted by the criminal justice system.
The guidelines ask prosecutors to take into account more how Māori and other groups are impacted by the criminal justice system and the effects of colonisation.
So, a misstep on Jagose's part, with bad timing in releasing those guidelines when the government had just issued a public service directive asking for need not race-based decision-making.
There's also pressure mounting when it comes to the response to the abuse in care inquiry, and we're going to see that big national apology on November 12. So there's still a bit to play out here, but so far Judith Collins is backing her Solicitor General in public.
And I was going to say, given that length of tenure, you would think that sort of up till now she hasn't really put many feet wrong, if you like.
I think that she is well respected within the legal fraternity. She's strong, she knows her mind, and I think that people do respect that. Like you say, she's been there for a really long time, and yeah, I guess that there's been no reason to get rid of her thus far.
What is the concern about her role in the abuse and care case?
There are many concerns that stretch over a really long period of time. So when we're talking about the Solicitor General, you remember that she worked at Crown Law as a lawyer before she was Solicitor General. So she worked on some of these cases. Exactly how closely she worked on each individual case when it came to a abuse and care survivor is hard to know, but we do have some documentation through the Royal Commission of Inquiry that shows emails that were sent while she was a lawyer talking about putting pressure on people in order to cause mental distress to survivors, which, she suggested might see them drop a case, give up on their legal battle. So
that's a pretty hard line.
It is pretty hard line. And, these are internal government emails that, perhaps she thought would never see the light of day, but they have now.
And this presumably was with the aim of saving the Crown money.
Exactly. Because some of these cases would have set massive precedents for survivors' cases going forwards, what it would mean in terms of, say, using the statute of limitations for ACC compensation from potential payouts from the Crown. There are a lot of these civil cases where these abuse survivors faced absolutely horrific stuff, and so you start going, well, how much should you pay someone who faced a lifetime of that? So these are potentially big figures, and you could kind of open the floodgates. When you look throughout the Royal Commission of Inquiry report, and when you read reporting from the likes of Aaron Smale, who's written a lot for Newsroom and others on this, you can see that the Crown and Crown Law and people like the Solicitor General and the lawyers there threw everything at this, and it looked like a win by any means situation. So the Crown has an obligation to act as a model litigant. That means, that should hold itself to the very highest standard. It can choose when it advances certain legal battles or challenges. It doesn't have to just use them in order to win. It can decide, is that right? If we're being a model litigant, and it doesn't seem like the Crown followed its own rules in that situation. It threw everything at it. So I mentioned those emails. There was the use of private investigators to investigate survivors and their families when they were caught up in civil cases and legal challenges against the Crown. There was the withholding of really important documents. In one case, Crown Law had documents that could have been handed over to police for an investigation that they were doing, which had information that would suggest, if not prove, that some of the children who were at Lake Alice faced torture. We know that now, but we could have proved this, or this could have been out in the public domain a lot earlier had some of those documents been handed over.
And in
by
that
Crown
case,
Law.
the case failed on behalf of the person who had suffered, right?
Yes, yeah. And then there are other withholding of documents as well. You'll know that when there is a court case, there is the period of discovery where, the Crown and others are supposed to hand over all of the relevant documentation, and some things that seem incredibly relevant that Crown law held and that the Crown and the state held were not handed over, such as prior convictions for sexual offending by these abusers who were in these institutions. These were not handed over to survivors' lawyers. So the fact that people that they were accusing and alleging had sexually abused them, the fact that they had prior convictions and that the Crown knew about them, that was not handed over. So all of that together, some of it when the Solicitor General was a lawyer working for Crown Law and some of it while she was the Solicitor General, that was some examples of what was going on.
So how has she justified that?
There hasn't been a good justification. So she came in front of the Royal Commission of Inquiry.
I acknowledge that to those who have courageously spoken in public before this commission about your experience at Lake Alice, the pain and suffering you have endured, and the impacts on your lives. Tēnā koutou katoa. Along with many other survivors, you will forever be associated with the courage and the persistence you have shown in your long fight against the behemoth that is the state and its bureaucracy.
And she, when put under pressure and asked point blank whether torture happened, she said yes. It meets the definition. What happened at Lake Alice was torture. There was no way to deny that that was the case. She also, apologised.
And I take this opportunity on behalf of Crown Law to apologise unreservedly to you, Ms McEnroe, for that. We did not treat you with respect and dignity. We caused additional trauma with what was already a very difficult part of your life to face.
For what had happened and for how Crown Law had conducted itself in the past. And she said that Crown Law had not always been survivor-focused, did say that things have now changed because of that, because they had seen that they had not acted as a model litigant, but then asked why all of these things happened. She didn't have a good explanation.
And she hasn't talked to you?
No. I've received brief written statements from her office.
Okay. Because one of the interesting things was when she was talking to those university students, as you mentioned before, is that she talked about...
Our client is, and this might sound a little bit knobby, actually the people of New Zealand.
So I guess there's two strains of thought here, and Tim, this might be your area. Is that duty to save the people of New Zealand possibly billions of dollars in compensation? Or are the survivors, the people of New Zealand, is the duty to the survivors? So is there any indication of what she was thinking with that balance?
Well, I don't think we can tell, but I think the duty is to justice and to truth. And, the biggest criticism, the most pertinent one paragraph, I think, from the Royal Commission, not on the torture element and the treatment of and the actual abuse incidents. Beyond that, on this process of the Crown conducting effectively what some would say is lawfare against the survivors over decades, the biggest point was the Crown, politicians, officials, ministers, did it spending taxpayers' money over a considerable time and over a considerable expense, basically to save money, yes, but reputations as well. Reputations of all those aforementioned people. It was a very, very, very powerful paragraph in the Royal Commission that summed up their thinking on this, and I think was one of the most important paragraphs in a Royal Commission since way back to Mahon and the orchestrated litany of lies. It really did get to the point of this, which is the second big scandal, I think. There's twin scandals here. There's the abuse and the evil then, and then there's the re-abuse. And the motivation for that, as you've said, was A, to save exposure through precedent to possibly billions of dollars, and B, to cover up, and that's what the Royal Commission said, not my words, cover up what had gone on and who was responsible and what ought to happen. And a lot of that was driven by saving reputations. So there's a big area here where I think her office and her, because she's been 8 years in that office, and as Laura said, had been deeply involved in a number of those cases where survivors were seeking to take on the Crown and the state. She was very highly involved in those. Those emails show that a lot of the cases where concerns have been raised specifically and case study concerns in the Royal Commission report, there's one name comes up, or at least one role comes up that when you look into it, one name comes up out of that. So I think there's a very deep awkwardness now that it's been exposed that our junior law officer, but our chief executive of Crown Law, was very closely involved in what now Royal Commission has said is deeply wrong as that second wave of scandal. But not just that, this government has accepted torture occurred, there was a cover-up, we're going to try and put that right to the best of our ability. And the putting that right isn't just money, it isn't just apology, it's also that for future cases that the Crown, the legal system, needs to invert what it's been doing under the Solicitor General, which was to fight and delay and try and wait out, time out, psych out survivors, to removing impediments, offering support in terms of even like legal aid, but removing statute of limitation impediments that stop cases being taken because of time elapsed, removing or adjusting the ACC limitation that says, well, you can't in this system, under our ACC system, make a claim either, and bringing things to the front of the queue for courts to hear them. So putting some urgency because people are dying and being delayed too long. So that huge change the Royal Commission is suggesting is reversing what Crown Law's been doing. I think sensibly, any government now going forward would say, well, if we're going to change 180 degrees the approach that our law agency has been taking, does it stand up that the person leading that can lead that change?
So the figurehead has to go.
Well, I think under any other public official highlighted by a Royal Commission in the manner in which this one has been, that person wouldn't be in their job. The Royal Commission didn't dance around it. And it's very clear, whether you read it explicitly or implicitly, that their feeling is that there was great wrong strategy and wrong tactics and wrong outcomes under her tenure and in the cases that she was involved in.
And Tim Murphy points out they were not just talking about historical cases.
There was an explicit Crown Law failure, not 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 12 years ago, but in 2020. The UN had found actually that, yes, torture had occurred. The police started another inquiry, their third, into the Lake Alice allegations, after two that were inconclusive and flawed and failed. The police in 2020, when Una Jagose was the Solicitor General, asked Crown Law for documents that they had at hand in these cases that are pertinent. And again, for the second time, Crown Law withheld from the police. So this is the prosecuting law agency of the state not giving the investigating law agency of the state the full information. So that's the kind of thing that is exposed as well. So you've got a very recent example of almost unjustifiable. And when the first failure to provide was raised at the Royal Commission, Una Jagose went to the Commission and said that ought to have been provided. There's no explanation for why that wasn't provided. So the police were scratching their heads and thinking, what's going on here? So there's deep concern, I think, that needs to be accepted and regarded. And, the government's going to make an apology. It's going to try and change. It's going to look at forward cases. It really, really needs to look at who is the right person and figure to progress that.
What do the survivors want?
They want her to go. Survivors do not speak with one voice. So lots of different people have different ideas about how things should go, how things should change. Some people also just don't have the energy or the resources to speak up or to fight this. But people who I have spoken to, they want her to go. They say that anyone who is involved with their cases shouldn't be leading this work going forwards. They shouldn't be, in the public service, in those highest public service roles. But they expressly point out the Solicitor General. They say that she was leading this, she was at the front of it, she was responsible, and they can have no confidence in what the government does from here on out while she is still in that position.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Ben Pearce and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Tim Murphy and Laura Walters. I'm Alexia Russell. Mā te wā.